Welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity, where we talk to individuals that have broken into cybersecurity, sharing their backgrounds, their challenges, and what they did to overcome them so that you can follow in their journey. Sean, tell us a little bit about what got you interested into cybersecurity.
My background before cybersecurity was software engineering. So I really got interested in how, as I was learning about building software, I got interested in how you could use the same concepts to break software. So building tooling, building software that breaks other software was very interesting to me. So vulnerability research, exploit development. And I think a lot of security engineers that come from an engineering background, they generally start in kind of an adjacent space, whether it's reverse engineering or bug finding. But that's kind of how I got initially interested in security. I thought there was a lot of different creative ways to solve a lot of challenging technical problems. And I thought it was an exciting way to like apply a lot of the concepts I'd learned in software engineering to those interesting problems.
And what got you into software engineering to begin with? How did that career start?
I think I wanted to build things and it felt like a good way to just create something from scratch and then, build products, build features, things that people use and things that create value for other people. I thought that was always a interesting opportunity, exciting opportunity in software engineering. So this would have been probably like 7 or 8 years ago now. That's kind of what got me interested or excited about software engineering.
So as you started to learn and grow in your software engineering career and started to pick up some of the concepts, what were some of the techniques that you would pass on to others that you could also apply in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think just being kind of investigative and being very curious, like trying to understand why things are happening and trying to dig deeper into what things are going on, whether it's in your code or in your applications. I think the user empathy side as well. So like if you're building products, like trying to understand how your users are getting value from those products, whether it's an enterprise product or a consumer app, whatever it might be. I think in security, like if you're working in a security team, it's similar in that like you have, maybe you're not building products, you might be building tools, internal tools for other parts of the company to use. So in a way, your customers or your users are like, the other, the other people in the business, given that like, security is kind of serving the other employees of the business as like a function, as like a tool, and then, they're your customers. So I think that kind of product and user empathy is something that carries over definitely. And in both is very, very important to cultivate because at the end of the day, if you're solving technical problems, you're doing interesting things, but you're trying to create value for your business, whether it's in software engineering, like through software that creates value, or in security engineering through like risk reduction. So, reducing vulnerabilities or reducing security risk to your business.
How do you balance that out when you're talking to a business leader going, well, I can create a new feature, or I can go back and fix these bugs or mitigate these defects that we found in the code. How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting today. Like, it's a lot of the challenge in that is incentivizing engineering teams as well, I should say, to kind of think about the risks of not fixing vulnerabilities and incentivizing them to fixing them, kind of making them a KPI of engineering almost. So there's other ways that we can get engineering teams just as priced into like keeping their workload secure as like security. And then coming back to your question, like that makes it a lot easier for that conversation when the CISOs are like managing up to the board or to other stakeholders, and then they're able to make that case for like, fixing that bug instead of shipping that feature. And, whether it's like they're communicating with the chief risk officer or chief financial officer, generally speaking, like they're able to whenever they're able to quantify cyber risk in terms of financial risk, then they can be quite successful in, getting people to invest and getting people to focus on security. But I guess it differs from organization to organization. And it really depends on the industry they were to get breached and what kind of impact or loss to the business would result from a breach. That generally is like what security leaders are about to do in order to, yeah, prioritize like security work over like engineering work.
As you kind of grew in your career, you mentioned finding synergies between the two. What recommendations do you have in kind of finding those synergies so you could achieve both at the same time?
I think for example, what we're trying to do with Nullify is productizing a philosophy that was very, very successful in Amazon called Security Guardians. And so Security Guardians was, I think, the first model where, engineering teams were able to self-serve security and security was able to distribute that ownership all the way throughout engineering teams very, very successfully. So I think like taking engineering teams on the journey and like, yeah, distributing that security ownership by putting some sort of a security champion or, making one of the engineering people a security champion or a security guardian is definitely like one way to do it. And so, like a lot of security guardians was very successful in doing that in a lot of different ways. One of them was like gamifying that kind of goal. So they would have scoreboards and kind of measure against teams, like who was fixing the most vulnerabilities and which workloads are the most secure and which were the most secure on average and taking the shortest time to keep vulnerabilities fixed. So I think there's a lot of different ways to get engineering teams excited about or kind of on the happy path, so to speak. But that's kind of what I've drawn a lot of inspiration from is seeing how these really, really large companies like Amazon have been able to do it at scale, do it successfully.
What about trying to avoid the defects or avoid the risks ahead of time? Have you seen any improvements in like spec driven architecture, spec driven code where it would reduce those defects coming out of the engineering teams ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the technology today is allowing us to find that stuff earlier and find better quality, but better classes of bugs, more novel bugs. I think with like the design review of some of those processes, like they're still being developed. It's still very difficult for engineers, security teams to negotiate with engineering leaders and say, this is something we need to spend time on this sprint, or, we need to spend time on before this big product release. I think that's still definitely a journey that they're on with a lot of their teams. I think like over time, that's going to get easier. But I think it really depends on like how well that engineering process is integrated with the security practices and how well those requirements defined by the security team.
Do you think it's the job of the security team to define those? Or do you think working with the business to define their risk thresholds are where they should be defined?
It's a good question. And right, like, where does that kind of responsibility lie? What's the kind of trust protocol there? Like, should security be much more of a function now of engineering as we start to kind of enter like this new age of how software is being built? It's hard to say, right? Like, I think a lot of engineering leaders now, like they even might have KPIs or OKRs around security, like not just in terms of like product and DORA metrics and how fast they're shipping, but like how secure are their workloads and like how secure are the trends in their workload, how good are the security trends in their workloads as well. So you could definitely make the argument of like a future where the security team is kind of just setting loose guardrails and policies, but then it's really up to the engineering teams to kind of own that whole journey end to end themselves. I think a good middle ground would be ideal, or like is like the best balance.
Mhm.
Security teams are the ones to say like at a business level, like this is what our obligations are, maybe to our auditors, to our customers, to other external stakeholders, and then engineering, however, really need to work with them and say like this is the capacity that we can give you, and you know assigning engineering resources to like meeting those requirements, whether it's like on a sprint by sprint basis, whether it's like, more kind of waterfall style projects where like quarterly there's initiatives that security is setting and engineering is kind of executing on them. But yeah, I think both approaches could definitely work. But I think the one where it doesn't work is where like security are not at all engaging engineering in those conversations. And it's like very one-sided. I think in those scenarios, it's very difficult for, yeah, the engineering team to like be successful and work with security without like a lot of friction.
And I think where security teams are brought in at the end and expected to bolt on security, and the business expects it to be frictionless and magical, that's also not a world where it will be optimized for the user flow either, because it wasn't designed with that security function from the beginning. So, have you started to see where there's potentially fusion teams and there's security analysts that might be involved from the beginning, where as they're designing requirements for the build out, for the architecture, that these requirements are being included?
Yeah, and that's actually a model that we've seen work really well in the past. A lot of security teams have adopted. They call it like, for example, like evil user stories, like whereas like an exercise, a threat modeling exercise with like
Hmm.
security engineers are present when, engineering teams are like designing features and, doing user stories for new products. And it's like their job to kind of play the devil's advocate and write user stories for like exploit scenarios and attack scenarios. So I've always thought that that kind of hand in glove approach could definitely be the way forward. Obviously now, like that's the reason that's going to be challenging to replicate, and that's even changing because maybe those engineering teams aren't even writing user stories anymore, right? Like the way that the rate at which they're shipping things, they might even just be vibe coding features, and they're not even writing user stories. They're not even doing those design specs or reviews. So what artifacts then can the security team even use to like reason about, other abuse or exploit scenarios in the features that engineering are building? As the practices change, as the processes change of building the software, then I think the security are going to have to get like more and more creative in figuring out how to like embed themselves more earlier in those processes.
The process is going to change. The approach that the security teams are going to have to change. If the teams are going to start using, like you mentioned, vibe coding, right? The security teams are going to have to use an outcome driven requirements approach, where they provide a full spec sheet of requirements from a security perspective, where they'll say, from security, we'll require that the code be encrypted at rest, encrypted during transit, that the application requires MFA, that there's persistent sessions only last for 4 hours, and then there's another reauth, and design kind of all those security requirements from an outcome perspective
Mhm.
right into the build of those applications. And you just have to change the approach to evolve with the times.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's kind of the way the engineering teams could self-serve like the secure design patterns. And so it's up to security to keep on maintaining them, govern them, and measure their adherence across all the different workloads. Like are the engineering teams, adhering to those design patterns that they've defined? I agree. Like it just has to change. It just has to keep evolving. The way it has before, like I'm pretty sure we saw something very similar, like 10, 15 years ago with like bug bounty, right? Like bug bounty platforms and BDPs like really started to take off when, that was just, security's new way of like keeping up with the external attack surface growing very, very quickly. So yeah, I think that's definitely one approach. There's a lot of talk right now, obviously, about like, injecting the enforcement of these guardrails, design patterns through guardrails at like the kind of IDE stage and
Hmm.
going nearer to like when developers are doing work. Other approaches are much more like, continuous, obviously autonomous pen testing and kind of continuous vulnerability detection from agents also means that security can get more coverage that way. So a lot of different approaches that I'm seeing that seem promising for sure.
You mentioned like the approach from your organization. What are some of the best practices that you've been seeing?
Yeah, I mean, with Nullify, like I think what we're trying to focus on is giving back the security teams time, FTE hours that they spend doing a lot of the work that we don't think is a good use of their time. So, triaging exploits, validating them for exploitability, discovering them, assigning them, having the negotiation between security and engineering teams with, messages or do Jira tickets and pull requests. All of that orchestration work downstream of that, I think is quite arduous, quite manual. I think they can spend time on more high leverage work, higher impact work for the security program. So I think that threat modeling, I think, is where they need to be focusing today. You mentioned like the design reviews and building out those capabilities. I think that's going to be much more important just because of like the class of the bugs are going to start to change as, the vibe coding keeps on picking up and companies keep on building software at a faster rate, right? Like it's going to be a lot more around the business logic of the application. And so like they need to be spending a lot more of their time figuring out like what's like the intended behavior of our applications and mapping those to their like, requirements as like at like a company level for security. So like if they're a healthcare company, like how does, their healthcare like regulatory obligations map to how they think about what their applications should or shouldn't do. So I think threat modeling is definitely where we're seeing like security teams like getting their time back, adopting AI tools to automate a lot of the work that they were doing before. And then they're kind of putting more effort into some of these more manual things that require like human intuition, like threat modeling. So that's kind of like what I'm seeing is, they're using these AI tools to kind of force multiply their efforts. And then they're able to then redeploy that the same human hours in different parts of the security program that are kind of like better value for them.
So for those that are looking to grow their career in this more modern agentic approach, how do you recommend that they learn but still keep the secure coding concepts and frameworks in mind as they're developing code or implementing software?
Yeah, look, I think if I was like an early career security person, I should say, I would think a little bit differently. Like I would think about how security leaders are thinking about building their programs and kind of work backwards from that kind of new approach. What I'm hearing from a lot of CISOs is like they would rather hire a smaller number of generalist kind of staff level security engineers and then get them to adopt a lot of AI tools to improve their coverage and their output and their ability to build the automations and processing that they need versus like a junior or a mid-level kind of security engineer in like every part of the security program. So actually I would encourage practitioners to kind of think a bit more holistically about how enterprises are going to measure the value that security builds and creates for their business. I think that's probably where I would be spending my time if I was looking to break into security or earlier in my security career.
Okay. So you mentioned hiring someone more junior that can help create automations for someone that is new and ambitious. How would you recommend that they go about creating automations that would drive that sort of business value?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing a lot of security teams like having a lot of success with Claude, right? Claude Code. A lot of them are building really interesting workflows around it. I talked to a head of security the other day that said, he has Claude like read all his emails, read all his Slack messages, like bubble up tasks and initiatives and, pieces of work and activities that are really critical. So, like giving Claude access and giving Claude context about, all the different priorities in the security program, all the different initiatives, ways that you are using AI or using agents to basically save you time and kind of like help you operate at like a higher level of functioning and a higher level of, just like speed in like your day-to-day tasks. Ability for Claude to like reason and remember things and these kind of agentic systems to remember things and know what to do and what the next best thing to do is. And then also if you give it the right tooling and the right access, like, actually go and perhaps do those things means that like security teams can handle a lot more work at the same time than they were able to before, which is definitely exciting. So yeah, if I was a security practitioner, I would just be, like publishing open source projects. Like, hey, this is this agent that I built to, automate these workflows, automate these practices or playbooks that like I've often done manually. And now it's maybe better than me at doing it. And this is how you in a security team, which maybe doesn't have that under the security engineers, can also adopt it or use that to be more productive.
Yeah, I've been doing that myself. I built a open brain system for myself where I use an agent and kind of like a super base backbrain between the different MCPs and sub-agents to kind of analyze tasks between my email and Claude and other things to keep me to keep me on track, but just on my personal machine, never on my work machine. But
Yeah,
it definitely helps when it comes to publishing this podcast because it helps do all the organization and social media when it comes to the pipeline to publish. So I can definitely agree with how much more efficient it's made me there.
absolutely. And if you think about it, like there's so much busy work, I think, in running a security program, right? Like imagine how much time you could get back to focus on making decisions or yeah, doing tasks that are actually creating impact. So it's scary to see how good it is, but I think it's also exciting to see like, where can we be more valuable? Where can we create more value? Because we're not having to do that busy work as much. So yeah, definitely exciting.
And any final recommendations that you would have for someone at this point, and it could be at any stage in their career?
I would just say, I think the security, the kind of business of security internally is like changing a lot and like being able to understand and empathize. I mentioned the user empathy before, when you asked about like, something that might carry over from software engineering. Any good software engineer like that, cares about their users is going to be better, right? Because they understand like how they're using the product and they're better building the product. And as a result, I think similarly in security, like really being able to empathize with the other stakeholders in the business so that like you can best not just like engage with them and make them successful with whatever you're building in security, but get the buy-in you need, whether it's like financial or whether it's time or whatever resources you're looking for in security. I think it's just going to be very, very difficult to do that no matter how technical you are. If you're not able to understand, like, what does the CFO care about, as it pertains to security, or like, how do I make this security initiative attractive to the CIO? Like, CISO cares about fixing vulnerabilities, maybe the CIO cares more about an outage and like the whole app going down, right? This is something I think that kind of mindset of trying to understand like security as an enabler and figure out like how to work backwards from what the other stakeholders of the business care about, I think is going to be like really, really important for like, yeah, early stage security people as well as all the way up. Yeah, I think it's going to be really important for understanding because I think what's happening in SaaS in general is that like people are really starting to define differently now how enterprises create value, right? Like previously, humans were using SaaS to perform knowledge work, make them more efficient. Now they're noticing that AI is actually better at performing that knowledge work. So humans have to now move to performing kind of intuition work. And so you're seeing in public markets, like SaaS companies, they're getting valued at different revenue multiples. People are starting to price SaaS products differently. So enterprises in general, they're kind of just at this turning point of like, well, how do we measure value? How do we create value? How do we define what value is? And so similarly, like in security, it's never been more important to understand how are other stakeholders in the business really, really care about? And then like, where does that leave me in security? Where does that leave security? And does it mean that I have to do more or less to kind of have a seat at that table or get them interested or get them engaged in security? Or, do I have to speak their language? What does that look like in order to get them on the security journey, so to speak? I think that's really important.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for coming on and joining us on Breaking Into Cybersecurity. Share the link to your LinkedIn and any other resources you want to share with our viewers, and we'll include that in the show notes. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Christoph.
Absolutely. Have a great day.